So just for the record, I will repeat that A.B. Masefield has since 1994 worked for the United Nations, UK Department for International Development, European Commission and several NGOs as an analyst and advisor on international policies and programs seeking to address hunger and malnutrition since 1994. A.B. has been a vegan for over 3 decades, has raised her 3 children as life vegans, and now has 3rd generation vegan grandchildren. She continues to work as an independent consultant while engaged in PhD research with Hill University Center for Human and Animal Studies, exploring the food justice agenda from a critical animal studies perspective. Okay, so you can start, and I will let you know when there will be 5 minutes to go.
Thank you. I am unmuted, am I? Can't see. Yeah. Okay. Can you all hear me all right? Yeah, good. Thank you. So yeah, it was a great start to the conference this morning. So much to think about, and I would already think about adding other things to my presentation. But anyway, that's really exciting. So yeah, you've given a bit of background to me already, and really my the work that I'm doing with my PhD research is really about, or I see it as reconciling the different parts of my life, the professional and this work on human hunger and malnutrition, and the dimension of my life, which is much more focused on the animal question and what it means to be vegan. So how do they relate? So the structure of the presentation will be covering some background about human hunger and malnutrition. I realize it's a very technical and complex area, and people will have different levels of understanding on that. So I'll try and just provide a sort of level playing field on what we're talking about there. Then look at how the animal, the question of the animal, is relating to that at the moment, the way current discursive landscape is evolving. What's the vegan line on it, and what are the kind of issues with that and the current kind of vegan entry point into this discussion, and how discussions of coloniality and animality can maybe help us to advance the engagement with this agenda, and where is the critical animals studies perspective on all of this. So to start with, in the introductory text for this conference, I was struck by the sentence that the ultimate success of critical animal studies will be measured in terms of the change in lived circumstances of non-human animals. And in fact, the violence of indifference, which we know a lot about with respect to animals, to quote from Simon Springer, the violence of indifference, we're familiar in respect to the daily slaughter of animals, but it's also very much evident on the other side of the animal-human divide. And it's often estimated that, you know, of all the atrocities in the 20th century, one of the most tragic for human beings was the fact that some 70 million people died of famine. Now, the question of famine and how it's defined is an extremely political and complicated one, as is all the data and measurement and understanding around what is hunger and food insecurity and malnutrition. But what we do know, if we use the UN data, is that close to half of all child deaths are related to malnutrition. And that means by 2030, even if we only count children under the age of 5, that will already have surpassed the number of people dying from famine in the whole of the 20th century. And many more have died of hunger and malnutrition beyond that age range. So we're talking about a huge and tragic situation that's very much a current one. So when we want to understand what's going on with human hunger and malnutrition, as I refer to it, there's 2 kind of questions initially to deal with. One is the scale of the problem and how many people are hungry or food insecure, malnourished in the world. And the second one is, of course, the huge one. Why is this so? What are the underlying causes? And this is the basis for what can be done. So what we see here is the latest data from FAO showing the percentage of people experiencing food insecurity in different parts of the world. And globally, it's 26%. According to this particular measurement using the food insecurity experience scale. But in fact, when you look more closely in the region of Africa, for example, you see it's close to 50% of the population. And although Asia looks fairly similar to the world in terms of about a quarter of the population, in fact, when we go into certain parts of Asia, such as South Asia, which has a population the same as Africa, we can see that it's often the majority of people in a country are food insecure by this measurement, maybe 80% in countries like India or Pakistan or Bangladesh. So I think it's important to also, when we're talking about the causes of hunger and malnutrition, to look at some of the very common misunderstandings in the narrative, the way human hunger and malnutrition is presented. First of all, it's often presented as a very natural problem, something that's a kind of pre-development, something which is an inevitable situation in countries that are not as developed as others. And there's lots of very colonial assumptions about people don't know how to look after themselves until the fundamentals of modernity and good governance are installed, and that those are very much dominant still within development discourse. Another misunderstanding or a myth is that the overarching problem of human hunger and malnutrition relates to food availability. There's not enough food for people, and that's why people are hungry. Then we have a problem in understanding around the idea that human hunger and malnutrition takes place in humanitarian emergencies and conflicts and crisis, and that's very bad, but it's not a normal state of affairs. That's another problem to be addressed in terms of the way we understand it. And finally, there's often an idea that perhaps this issue is now being overtaken by the fact of the nutrition transition, whereby diets have rapidly changed and more people in the world are consuming ultra-processed foods, convenience foods, and overweight and obesity now is killing more people than underweight, for example. So therefore, have we moved beyond human hunger? Are we in a post-hunger age, or are we entering one? Now, the food justice movement, the kind of drawing from critical food studies, the counter-hegemonic discourse, has made a really important contribution to challenging these kind of narratives and highlighting the extent to which they are articulated within broader ideology of developmentalism to justify and naturalize exploitative relations within corporate capitalism. So if we look at the issue, for example, of availability, it's now been well established that human hunger and malnutrition has very little to do with food availability. And as we know only too well, food insecurity is never inevitable. In the market economy, it's linked first and foremost to affordability. And the vast majority of the world are net consumers and not producers of food. So an individual or family needs to meet the cost of their necessities. When we look at the issue of the naturalization of human hunger, from the food justice perspective, a critical food perspective, human hunger is framed as a result of violence, an act of violence that's deliberately perpetrated to serve profit often. So we can't see human hunger as a natural state at all, rather the result of colonialism. And the majority of human hunger and malnutrition also exists among populations who are living in chronic poverty, not in situations of crisis. Often we associate pictures of starving children with war zones like Yemen or in Somalia, where there's a kind of breakdown. But in fact, the majority of starving children today, half of them live in India, for example. And finally, the nutrition transition, a term coined by Barry Popkin in 1993, this shift in what people are eating, which is accelerating around the world now, especially in poor rural communities, is not seeing the replacement of undernutrition with overweight, obesity, and non-communicable diseases like diabetes, heart problems, cancers, but it's actually seeing the coexistence. So we have people still undernourished, but at the same time, there's also obesity in the same families or in the same individuals, and there's severe deficiencies in micronutrients and lots of problems with NCDs. So there's this even worsening of the situation, a more complex understanding of what hunger and malnutrition really is needed. So what does all this have to do with animals? That's my overarching question. The animal is very loud. I couldn't have imagined when I started my research journey 5 years ago to what extent the animal would burst into the discourse on human hunger and malnutrition. It was beyond my dreams, and particularly driven by issues relating to the climate and ecological crisis, as well as the increasing concern about the surge in sickness and deaths as a result of the nutrition transition. So the medical journal The Lancet in 2019 described this as the global syndemic of obesity, undernutrition, and climate change, arguing that a holistic effort to reorient human systems to achieve better human and planetary health is our most important and urgent challenge. The findings from something called the Eat Lancet Commission in 2019 on healthy diets from sustainable food systems, many of you may have seen this. It provides the scientific targets for a healthy diet from a sustainable food systems perspective operating within the planetary boundaries. And the key message is that moving to a new dietary pattern will require global consumption of foods such as red meat and sugar to decrease by about 50%. And the increase in consumption of nuts, fruits, vegetables, and legumes must be huge, and it must at least double. So this planetary diet has very little meat in it. This is very much plant-based diet becoming mainstream, or so it seems. But there was an inevitable backlash. The backlash has been equally loud. And what was really interesting, surprising, a bit shocking, is that the backlash is particularly strong from the critical perspective. The left, the ecologically concerned, and the food justice communities, who've been quick to accuse the promotion of a plant-based diet with corporate interests. And the Eat Lancet Commission, in particular, has been strongly dominated by the private sector. There's another narrative also which needs to be contested at this stage, which is a narrative that as people become better off in poorer parts of the world, they naturally express their increased incomes via an increased consumption of animals. And I've always found this deeply problematic. I think on the one hand, there's been plenty of critique of the global narrative of poverty reduction and the extent to which that's actually taking place. But also there are many other factors driving the increased consumption of animals in low and middle income countries, not least the aggressive corporate promotion of eating animals in the context of convenience, fast, ultra-processed food, but also through the public sector, nutrition messaging, policy steering, and subsidies, and the UN agencies really backing this up. And by way of example, this document has just been released on the 1st of this month, a high-level UN nutrition document, significant because it's really a multi-agency consensus involving the World Health Organization, Food and Agricultural Organization, UNICEF, WFP, ILRI, etc. And it makes the case very strongly that livestock-derived foods, as it terms them, are an essential component of sustainable and healthy diets, whether by achieving nutrition equity or the promotion of livestock-based livelihoods. And I very much recommend watching the launch panel discussion at the link shown on the screen, where you can hear leading global experts explaining the evidence that supports their conviction that animal foods are absolutely critical for child growth and human development. And this obviously contrasts quite a lot to the lines of the Michael Greger kind of nutrition bubble that we might be more familiar with. The persistence of the scientific mainstream international development communities and the food justice movement's conviction that animal source foods are essential is reinforced by many other initiatives. And I won't go into the detail here just in the interest of time, but areas that I'm exploring in my research include ready-to-use therapeutic food, that's RUTF, which is a patented product manufactured by an international company that's to treat severe acute malnutrition or child wasting in parts of the world where that's a major problem. And the idea is the product removes the need for hospitalization. The food justice movement is very critical of the medicalization and such solutions to nutrition rather than strategies based on real food. And they see this as really dehumanizing people by failing to address the fundamental injustice that gives rise to this situation in the first place. But they are much less critical of the fact that the product itself is based predominantly on powdered milk along with vegetable oil and sugar, despite the fact that the majority of the world's population is lactose intolerant, and the highest percentage of that population being precisely in those parts of the world where acute malnutrition is most prevalent. And another example is indicators to measure the quality of diet around the world, such as minimum dietary diversity, whether it's for women or young children. And this is basically the grouping of foods into different categories and using food recall, asking people to explain which food groups they've consumed in the last 24 hours. And this is becoming increasingly influential data to inform policy decisions. And the problem here from a critical animal perspective is that a significant number of those food groups are actually based on animal-derived foods, whether it's dairy, meat, poultry, fish, or eggs. So therefore, this indicator has great significance because it reinforces the idea that without increased consumption of animal-sourced foods, development is not taking place and the Sustainable Development Goals will not be met. So my concern then is that the critical food or food justice communities are really neglecting this issue of promoting the consumption of animal source foods. They're neglecting it in their critique completely. And they're not just neglecting it, but they're actually actively promoting increased consumption of animal source foods for most of the population around the world, and really underscoring this issue that corporate-backed calls for a plant-based diet are really relevant only for high-income countries to rebalance the situation for good health, but a much more significant increase is required in the rest of the world. It's one rule for different places, it seems, different rules. So there's a real void when it comes to any kind of critical animal perspective here around this issue of human hunger and malnutrition. And this has really been highlighted in the consultative process around this document, which is the Committee for Food Security, the World Committee for Food Security, which is the global governance mechanism for these issues, coming out of Rome. And it has generated something called a voluntary guidelines for food systems and nutrition, which has just been released this year. And that consultative process, which took place over several years and has been very transparently documented, provides a really interesting site to track the animal across the discourses and reveals the marked absence of any challenge to the central assumption about the need for animals to support the livelihoods of poor people and advance their nutrition.
5 minutes.
Yeah. Sorry, so is somebody want to say something?
Yeah, just 5 minutes to go.
Okay, thanks. So the civil society mechanism of this broader World Committee has actually been very critical of the extent to which the voluntary guidelines doesn't really challenge fundamental power relations in the world, and to some extent continues to dehumanize the people who are experiencing this problem of hunger and malnutrition. But their alternative vision is very much continuing the idea that animals are absolutely crucial. So there's lots of references to the need to reduce the use of hormones, use more sustainable livestock production, women's role in animal husbandry, but nothing more critical than that. When we, yes, the UN Food System Summit is something which will take place this year, and again, will provide another opportunity. There'll be a lot of discourse around that and its outcomes. So, and likewise, the Nutrition for Growth Summit, also taking place right at the end of this year, started in London in 2013, and again, a lot of these messages coming out. So it's a real year for looking at this issue in terms of the global governance and narrative. Now, when it comes to the vegan society, or the classic vegan script and looking at vegan discourses around this, I personally find them quite disappointing, because the primary line taken remains anchored to a narrative about efficiency or availability, that eating animals wastes food that could otherwise be fed to hungry people, when actually the amount of food has never been an issue with the root cause of hunger and malnutrition. It's generally about access to food, affordability, and a denial of some and not others. So central to this line also is that eating animals is wrong because it hurts humans, and animal lives aren't framed as having their own intrinsic value. There's something missing from this positioning. And in my work, I'm looking increasingly to discourses around coloniality, because this really helps to better understand the mental logic, the epistemological order that emerged out of the 15th and 16th centuries, as many theorists have assessed, to rank humanity so that some become more humans than others, and many are branded as barely human at all. Mignolo, for example, argues that coloniality is the dark side of Western modernity, a complex matrix of power that's been created and controlled by Western men and institutions from the Renaissance, driven by Christian theology. And continues through the late 20th century to now under the dictates of neoliberalism. As Maria Logronis puts it, the dichotomous hierarchy between the human and the non-human is the central dichotomy of colonial modernity. And I would say that human hunger and malnutrition, its persistence and even its increase today, testifies to the fact that the colonial matrix of power is alive and kicking. And underpinning the food justice movement is a critique of the dehumanization of much of humanity, but not the dehumanization process that also applies, the de-subject process that also applies to animals. So when we look at decoloniality and what that implies, I'm particularly interested in the discussion around undoing the animal and really deconstructing mechanisms of animality. There's been an explosion of thinking around this convergence and the idea that decoloniality requires delinking from the colonial matrix of power. From a multiple or pluriversal decolonial vantage points, human hunger and malnutrition, it becomes dislodged from its framing as a natural state. Rather, it's reframed as an act of violence, but an act of violence which is taking place because much of the world has been coded as animal and positioned as a lower order. Billy Ray Belcourt, for example, argues that speciesism is a colonial mentality, and also that there's a fundamental distinction between the politics of intersectionality and decoloniality, because intersectionality grounds critical theory in difference and stabilizes the settler identity, whereas decoloniality seeks to deconstruct the worldview of modernity and coloniality more deeply. So while the discursive domain of food justice rejects the animalization of the human, what is preventing the refusal of the animalization of the animal? If there is a fundamental human non-binary, human or non-human binary at the core of coloniality, then decoloniality must necessarily begin by deconstructing that binary and exposing the workings of animality, which, as Carrie Wolf refers to, the species grid is the dark side of humanism. If I could ask for just 2 more minutes just to conclude, and then I'm almost there, thanks. To conclude then, the critique of the dominant discursive domain around human hunger and malnutrition really needs a critical animal perspective to dismantle this mindset of animality. And it is that drives the structural violence that tortures and slaughters trillions of sea animals, billions of land animals, and millions of human animals every year. Injustice, whether of eating animals or human hunger, is not an as well, but one and the same injustice. Jim Mason, in his book Unnatural Order, talks about the ridicule and shame associated with bringing animals into the discursive domains of humanism, and I certainly relate to this in my 30 years of working in this field. Such efforts are received by both dominant discourses on food security and counter hegemonic food justice movement discourse as either absurdly out of place, bad taste, dangerous, and damaging from the real efforts, diversion from the real efforts of saving lives. It's as if the humanist straitjacket seems to use the human-animal divide to guard against the animalization of humans. In many respects, coloniality, it could be argued, is tightening its grip on the world as the 21st century unfolds, and the species boundary is closely woven into our international order. So the takeaway I suggest is, what if human hunger and malnutrition cannot be addressed without dismantling the logic of animality? What if undoing the animal as an invention, the sum of what we do not recognize as human, to quote from Felice Simati, is key? And as the Finnish visual artist Terik Harpoja says well, approaching the question of the animal as a question of animalization of both humans and non-humans provides a more productive framework for both animal ethics and social justice. On the basis of this journey, tracking the animal across this discursive landscape of human hunger and malnutrition, I come back to wondering if an understanding of critical animal studies as only changing the lives of non-human animals is really enough. Thanks.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And now I will stop recording.